I'm joined today by Amanda Lewis, who's an associate professor in sociology and African American studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago and the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. She's also co-author of the new book, Despite the Best Intentions, How Racial Inequality Thrives in Good Schools. This is a super interesting topic, and I think to get us into it, it makes sense to define what the racial achievement gap is in the context of your book. What are we talking about when we say the racial achievement gap?
Okay, so the main idea is that when we look at national data, actually nationally and locally, but when we look at data on school outcomes, this could be test scores, GPAs, a whole range of things. We see a persistent gap between white students and Black and Latino students. That's what people typically mean when they say the racial achievement gap.
And in many cases, the analyses that are done of this racial achievement gap in schools look at, for example, poverty as an issue. They talk about family stability, and you often hear the term single parent homes, for example, and this type of analysis is done. But
Right.
you actually did a case study that decided to look at this in a different way, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. We were trying to pull apart some of the effects of race and class that often get conflated. So, obviously, there's also nationally big socioeconomic gaps. One of the quickest predictors you can use to figure out people's SAT scores is their class status, right? So, and the comparison that often gets made when people think about racial achievement gaps is between our kind of stereotypical majority minority underfunded public schools and highly resourced mostly white suburban schools. And so John and I wanted to take a slightly different take and look at what is a pretty common phenomenon, which is that even in districts like the district we studied, Riverview, where you have Black and white students together in the same district, they're officially, long term have been desegregated districts, and you have high resources, so this is not an under-resourced community by any means, we still see gaps in outcomes. And the question is, how come even in places like Riverview do we see those kinds of gaps?
So, a common refrain from some people who I don't agree with is often, well, you have to look at the parenting. Even if you equalize for the district and you give these kids the same teachers, etc., you should really be focusing on the parenting and sort of how important education is to the parents, because
Right.
that is an influencing factor on the children. What's your reaction to that? And what did your research actually uncover?
Absolutely, you're right. I mean, the common sense of that is even elevated in recent years. It's kind of the reverse tiger mom problem, right? So people assume that Asian American students are doing well because their parents are putting much pressure on them, and therefore students who aren't doing well must be doing not be doing well because their parents aren't invested or don't care or any of that sort of thing.
Right.
And that was one of two really widely available common sense ideas about school achievement that we both felt like we had to explore, but that became pretty clearly right away not what was going on. So we found that Black kids and parents cared about school just as much as others. They invested as much time and energy in it. We found what our colleagues like Annette Leroux found when she looked at middle class families, that Black and white middle class parents are advocating for their kids, reminding them to do their home. All the same things are going on in different families. What's different is the kind of constraints they face and the kind of reactions they get from schools.
So let's get into that. You and I, for the first few minutes, have sort of been talking about the traditional notions that you found to be untrue. What
Right.
did you discover as to what factors may be at play in fomenting this racial achievement gap?
Well, one of the kind of big ideas has to do with all the ways that race shapes our daily interactions. So, John and I draw on a lot of research from actually cognitive and social psychology, which tells us that race is what many would call sort of a primary category. It's one of those categories, as soon as you see somebody, you categorize them along racial lines, along gender lines, age. There's a few kind of things that we do kind of automatically without thinking about it.
This is sort of like your instant first impression of someone. It's not about whether they're necessarily good students or like certain types of movies. There's these basic assessments that we instantly make.
Absolutely. And most of that happens at at a subconscious level. But that process of categorizing is not neutral. It carries with it all kinds of cultural beliefs. Some people would call them stereotypes that influence whether or not we think somebody is likely to be college bound or not, whether or not we think somebody's likely to be more threatening or not. There's been lots of examples in popular in the country in recent weeks about how we tend to think of certain groups as being more physically threatening or more likely to be criminal and all that. But that kind of subtle process happens not just outside of schools, but also in schools. And so the kind of performance expectations that result from this mean that some kids are constantly getting little reminders, little pushes, get your homework in, you didn't do well on that last exam, whereas other kids are not getting that kind of feedback or getting very contrary feedback, getting in trouble more, having more surveillance, having more feedback that what they're doing is breaking rules, that sort of thing. And those sort of things add up over time in lots of complicated ways.
And what are some specific ways, I guess, in which, you spoke generally of that, but specifically
Yeah.
in your case study, talk a little bit about what you observed in terms of teachers doing.
So I'll give you a couple examples. One very clear example comes from school disciplinary practices, which are more important than you might think. So even though we're talking about academic achievement outcomes, school disciplinary practices are a signal to everybody about who's a full citizen in the school and have deep implications for kids' sense of belonging in a school, all of which impact their engagement and achievement. So one easy example at Riverview was there was a rule in the school that if you were in the hallway during class time, you had to have a pass. And what we heard from kids, from teachers, from Black and white students was that white students in the hallway without a pass were kind of ignored or just let go, whereas Black students in the hallway without a pass were given detention or punished in some way. And this kind of pattern made more explicit for everybody things that were happening all the time in classrooms. So we heard lots of examples of kids, Black kids showing up for AP or honors classes. This is a school that has a lot of internal segregation, so that white students are much more likely to be in AP and honors classes, and Black students are much more likely to be in regular classes. But even when Black students showed up for AP and honors classes, teachers would say, "Oh, I think you're supposed to come later. You might be a little bit early for this class." Or we heard students talked a lot about who did and didn't get invited to be in study groups. One of the most painful early examples of this that we heard was from an African-American teacher who said as she was talking to us that she realized that even though the very reason that she had become a teacher was in many ways to try to help more African-American students be successful as she had been, to enjoy school, she was starting to realize that in her own daily practice in school, because she perceived white students to be likely to be coming from middle and upper middle class families, she had heard from her peers that parents were likely to harass, to get involved, to call a lot if their kids weren't doing well, that she had discovered she was more likely to kind of nudge them along, to follow up if they weren't doing well in an exam, to make sure they had turned their homework in. And again, it didn't reflect her own values or what she wanted to be doing or which kids she particularly cared about, but it had to do with a kind of wider set of assumptions. And for her, it was like this proactive acting in anticipation that parents were likely to intervene. And that, which she articulated very clearly, we started to see among a lot of teachers across subject areas.
In the last bit of time we have left, I'm curious, thinking of your detention example, if we go beyond just in-school detention, but into the juvenile justice system, are there factors at play there that may also be playing a role in the racial achievement gap in schools?
Well, I think, we draw on some of the metaphors and research from juvenile justice because the parallels are very clear. We found kids get differentially selected into discipline and then differentially processed once they get into the disciplinary process. And that's very similar to what goes on within the juvenile justice system. And both of those dynamics have to do partly with resources. So what kind of resources families have to bring to bear on a kind of process that goes on. But it also has to do with the way that race itself can be a symbolic resource. For some kids, functioning as a kind of protective factor, and for other kids putting them at more risk. And so, for instance, there's lots of interesting research by Philip Goff, by Jennifer Eberhardt, and others that says that Black kids are more likely to be perceived as being older. They're more likely to be perceived as being intentionally defiant, whereas white kids are more likely to be perceived as being playful, or boys will be boys, or were perceived as being developmentally appropriately sort of goofy, right? So the very ways that we respond to very similar behavior by kids sets them on different trajectories, which then over time have real implications for where they end up, both within schools, but also outside of schools. So when we think about police shootings, when we hear about the kind of responses that even those police say, we hear them say things like they felt threatened, right? And that sense of threat is something that happens, again, often subconsciously, but has deep implications for youth experiences both inside schools and beyond.
I'll remind the audience that much of what we've been discussing today is in the book, Despite the Best Intentions, How Racial Inequality Thrives in Good Schools. We've been speaking with one of the book's authors, Amanda Lewis. Thank you so much for talking about this.
Thanks for having me.